good now. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Journalists and Writers Foundation for inviting the Institute for Economics and Peace here today. I'm going to perhaps take us to a wider frame. I'm also going to speak from a data-driven perspective, and I'll talk a little bit about the work that the Institute for Economics and Peace is doing in this space, how we're trying to measure peace, and what we can learn from those measurements that can help inform us as to what's going on in the world, where are we making progress, or where are we deteriorating, and then how can we more tangibly think about investing in the factors that drive peaceful societies. What does that mean for prevention? What does that mean for sustaining peace as a concept or as a political concept? So just briefly, my organization is a not-for-profit independent think tank. We're headquartered in Sydney, Australia, and we were established in 2008 to try to measure peace and understand the economic benefits that increases in peacefulness can bring to the global economy. So everything we do is from that quantitative perspective. It's also mostly from a global perspective. So I'm not going to focus in on any specific country, for instance, or specific culture. So just to start, I'd like you to think briefly about how we define peace. Now, at the Institute for Economics and Peace, we are taking definitions that we can use for measurement. So they have to be specific. We're working within normative frameworks, and we're using the concepts of negative and positive peace that were put forth by the peace theorist Johann Galtung, and we've attributed our own definitions to this for the sake of the measures that we do. So negative peace refers to the absence of violence or the absence of the fear of violence in this context. So the starting point for us with negative peace is to imagine a society with no crime, no jails, no police. That's obviously an idealistic society. It doesn't exist, and we're not suggesting that we should be there, but there should be some balance. Now, negative peace is also the state that might ensue after a ceasefire in a country. Killing might go down. But negative peace doesn't tell us about what is needed to sustain peace in a society. It doesn't inform us as to what drives peace. How is that upheld? So positive peace for us is defined as the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. Now, in other contexts, for instance, Sustainable Development Goal 16, aspects of positive peace are conceptualized through the language around strong institutions and presence of justice. So here we're talking about the fact that peace is also not just the absence of something, but it's composed of something as well. And that something requires political will, or it requires civil society action, but it does require some sort of action. So I was asked to speak about the breakdowns in peacefulness and indicators of improvement. So I'm just going to set the stage for the breakdowns in peacefulness, what we are experiencing today in the world, what the data says about it, and why that also means that there's more urgency to think about conflict resolution, peace building, and in longer term efforts, prevention and sustaining peace. So each year, my organization produces the Global Peace Index. Now, this is a measure of 163 countries and territories around the world, and this looks at negative peace. So this is looking at levels of militarization, societal safety and security, ongoing domestic and international conflict. There's 23 different indicators, and so it's really showing what we don't want in a society. And so what are we seeing? And I'm just going to highlight some of the trends since 2008. So essentially, over the last 10 years, globally, we've seen a deterioration in peace of 2.3%. So things are getting worse. We've seen declines in peace in 8 of the last 10 years globally. Europe, which has consistently been the most peaceful region in this index, over half of the countries in Europe have deteriorated in peacefulness in the last 10 years. No Nordic country is more peaceful now than it was in 2008. And I'm highlighting that also because those are the countries that tend to top some of the other indices. And not to say that they're still not in the most peaceful countries in the world, but the most peaceful countries are getting less peaceful. 62% of countries have experienced an increase in the impact of terrorism over the last decade. Nearly 1% of the global population is now displaced. And people ask, well, what have been any of the positive trends? We've seen more positive trends in terms of militarization, in terms of military expenditure and number of armed forces. But in general, this situation means that we are more unstable, looking at issues like terrorism, homicides, for instance, internal conflicts, which have gone up, deaths from internal conflict. We're facing conflicts within societies more and more. It's not just wars between countries that we're dealing with. And these issues are related to each other and they impact a global population. We've heard about refugees, tolerance, permissiveness. What does that mean for a society in which migration, displacement is going to have an impact no matter what your value systems are? And what we've also seen is that there's an increasing inequality in peacefulness. So in general, the more peaceful a country was in 2008, the less likely it was to have deteriorated in peacefulness over the last decade. So there is a certain resilience. But here you can see the growing inequality in peacefulness. The red line shoots up from about 2012. The green line, the most peaceful countries, is staying around the same, although it's also deteriorating. So what we're seeing here is that there's been a much larger impact and a much faster and greater deterioration in peace in the least peaceful countries than in the most peaceful countries. So these elements of instability and conflict are completely destabilizing. And countries that have less resilience, that are more fragile, then tend to get embedded more quickly in these cycles of violence. So that's the context in which we're now working as a global community. So how can we think more strategically and more tangibly about what it means then to build peace? So what we've done to try to better understand positive peace is that we've taken about 8 years of data from the Global Peace Index, and we've compared it to almost 9,000 different data sets. And these data sets are massive global cross-country data sets. They're broadly encompassing different socioeconomic indicators. They're looking at attitudinal surveys as well. What we're trying to do is, as much as we can from the limitations of the data too, is to encompass and encapsulate both formal and informal structures, elements that are about relationships between people, but also citizens, government, and policies. And what we've found is that we've identified this 8-part framework, the pillars of positive peace, that correlate most strongly with the most peaceful countries. And so this framework of positive peace helps us to better understand the capacities and the strengths of countries. What we're trying to do from this frame is to adjust it to think about what drives peace, not just what is a risk for conflict. So how do we strengthen structures of resilience, structures of peace, rather than just focus on reducing violence. And so to that end, I hope that this framework can be informative in these discussions of prevention and sustaining peace. What does it mean to sustain peace versus what does it mean to invest in peace building, for instance? So these 8 pillars, and I'll go through them in a moment, are interrelated and they're each multidimensional. So we see a well-functioning government included, and that includes government effectiveness, effective judicial systems, and the extent to which citizens are allowed to have a voice in decision-making, a sound business environment that refers to the economic framework for business set by government, and the presence of supporting infrastructure such as internet access, business sophistication, and overall market conditions, an equitable distribution of resources. That's much more than income. It's also about land, water, education, healthcare, and justice distribution throughout a society. The acceptance of the rights of others, so that includes respect and tolerance towards both genders, towards migrants, towards other religions and ethnicities, good relations with neighbors around a country's capacity to use diplomacy to manage disagreements and to positively manage relationships with other countries, the free flow of information, so media freedom, how citizens can gain access to information, is the media free and independent? High levels of human capital, which is around education and youth development, and finally, low levels of corruption, which is fairly self-explanatory. So this represents a peace system, and it shifts thinking from an overt focus on what makes countries violent to what makes countries peaceful and resilient. And one of the advantages of this framework is that it's also helping us measure resilience. So what we've seen is that when we measure positive peace, countries with higher levels of positive peace are also better able to manage internal shocks. And those shocks can be political in nature, they can be environmental. But what we do know, and this was brought up in the presentation before, is that there will always be conflicts, and conflict doesn't need to necessarily be negative. It's how you manage conflict and how you mitigate conflict in a nonviolent manner. So what we're suggesting here is that by investing and strengthening these pillars of positive peace, we can strengthen a society's ability to mitigate conflict in a nonviolent manner. Now, in fact, what we've seen also is that societies with higher levels of positive peace have better outcomes on a range of factors that are considered important, such as high per capita growth, better environmental performance, less violent civil resistance movements, and less violent political shocks. And when you're looking at this, you might think, well, this is great, but it's vague too to my particular culture. It's not expressing the nuances of how these pillars play out in a specific cultural context. And that's something that we're very aware of, and that what we're trying to do then is to bring this framework as an empirically derived framework to different communities around the world, and to conduct workshops where people can discuss these pillars and think about whether they are in agreement, one, that these factors are all important for peace in a society. Two, we hope that it moves conversations away from blame on various groups for different violence or instability, and it becomes a framework around which people can have productive discussions. And three, that they can also talk about, well, how does this actually manifest? What does equitable distribution mean, not from a data perspective, but what does that mean in my particular community? And how can I think about investing in areas of building peace in my society that take into account that these areas all need to be strengthened. We can't just strengthen high levels of human capital without addressing corruption, for instance. And so finally, I wanted to leave you with one piece of information from this year's measure of positive peace around the world. So I talked a little bit about the 8 pillars. Well, what we've seen, and I think it's relevant for this conference and this discussion, is that the pillar of acceptance of the rights of others, that's the pillar that's broadly encompassing elements of human rights, formal and informal laws that guarantee basic rights, including gender equality, workers' rights, and the level of tolerance between different ethnic, linguistic, religious, and socioeconomic groups within the country. This pillar has deteriorated across every region in the world since 2013. It's deteriorated in the United States and in Europe since 2005. So not to say that we shouldn't be focusing on all of the pillars, but when we see these imbalances, what we've found from the research is that where there are imbalances in the pillars, that can be a potential risk that's just as strong as a weak positive peace system. So what this suggests is that we also need to understand, analyze, and take into better account how we can strengthen acceptance of the rights of others and what that relationship is in various countries between peace and stability and acceptance of the rights of others. And I'm very happy to answer more questions about this work. I also have some material here for everybody. Thank you very much.